welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. My name's Laura Gordon. I'm one of the regular panelists, and I'm also the Liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate in Sheffield Hallam. And I'm here with Sam Al-Hamdani, who is another of our panelists. Sam, how are you?
Very good, thank you.
So we are here to break a habit of the podcast and talk about social media. This has come out of a discussion that we sort of had on the podcast WhatsApp group. And Sam, I don't know, do you want to sort of talk through a little bit? And I think the first thing to say is that this is not going to be a podcast about social media campaigning, because this is a podcast that firmly believes that knocking on doors and delivering leaflets is the way to win elections. So Sam, what is it going to be about?
Well, it started off by talking about an article, so it's polling from John Curtis, talking about how Britain was increasingly liberal, increasingly sane in many ways, but then looking at the same time, it being very polarised. And then the conversation went on how that plays out on social media and what impacts that has for us as people who are involved in politics and for political discourse. You know, what that extreme kind of magnification does, and how you cope with that, and what you do with that.
Yeah, and we thought that this would be quite an interesting week to do it as well, because obviously there's been, for those of us that are on Twitter, which I suspect is a disproportionate share of podcast listeners compared to the majority of the population. We've obviously seen the buyout of Twitter by Elon Musk, the sort of unbanning of various sort of far-right voices that have been previously banned from the platform, discussion about what free speech means, and also potentially the sort of imminent collapse of Twitter, migration of a few people to Mastodon. I've set up a Mastodon account. I have to say I don't use it that much, but I do have one. So I think we thought it was a sort of good moment to just pause a little bit and discuss sort of what social media has meant for politics and how it's shaped political discourse over the last few years. And I think this kind of point about the sort of liberalism of the general public and the sort of increasingly liberal views is a really interesting one, because I think there is a real tendency on Twitter, and I think especially the way sort of things go viral and get quote tweeted, to sort of magnify some of these really extreme voices, aren't there?
It absolutely is. I mean, the classic example. So, we've just had the reinstatement of Donald Trump on Twitter from a poll, which I didn't see the final result, but when I did look at it about a day before it ended, was on 52% to 48%, which is brilliant.
The cursed ratio.
Exactly. But it's, I think that the quote underneath it, Vox Populi, Vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. But except that's not. It's a self-selecting voice and a self-selecting group of people who have chosen to interact on that specific topic that they feel passionately about enough to feel that they have to click on it. So that's not the voice of the people. Part of me then goes, that is the problem of democracy. It is a self-selecting group of people.
Yeah, but I think this is the key point, isn't it? Because it's that salience point where sort of there are lots of things that people have opinions about, but that won't necessarily be the things that will drive their voting behavior. And so, a sort of opinion poll evidence that sort of says, well, this percent of people believe this, but then they're actually voting for a party that believes other things. You can point to the kind of salience issue. But then what people talk about on social media will be defined by the issues that they individually find most interesting, which almost means that sort of social media discussion is driven by the issues that people feel really passionate about, which will often not be the issues that drive mainstream voting behavior, even if the sort of mainstream voters might, whether they agree or disagree, that, those won't be the issues that will sort of drive discourse. People don't really go on Twitter very often to kind of talk about the generalized state of the economy and gas prices, but actually that will be what drives voting behavior, or they might do, but it will only be for a kind of very short spike whenever there's a sort of change in those prices, whereas actually that sort of underlying impression will be what drives the voting behavior. So I think there is a really interesting kind of point there about, people will talk about the issues that they really care about, but often you'll have a sort of an issue which will matter hugely to a small group of people, which most people won't actually be that bothered by. And I think sort of there's a real challenge for politicians, isn't there, about sort of, you don't want to dismiss those issues as unimportant, because, I think probably the classic example at the moment would be the sort of trans rights issue, where so the US Republicans just tried to run a really big campaign on trans rights and sort of opposition to trans rights. And it turned out that the public was really not that interested, which is why one of the reasons why the Democrats did a lot better than expected. But, you don't want to dismiss that as an unimportant issue, because if you are trans, then it's a hugely important issue. But I think that, because of that, because it matters so much to a sort of relatively small group of people, it can sort of dominate the Twitter discussion in a way that isn't really relevant to the majority of people. And I think if you listen to it too hard, can lead you astray.
And I think it's interesting that, so Twitter it has this reputation of being the place where people go to fight, basically. And I think a large part of that is just the basics of discourse on Twitter are restricted by how much you can say. You can't have a thorough conversation on Twitter. It's designed to not have thorough conversations. It's designed for you to just shout your point in the fewest number of words possible, and then go away. So the system defines, in part, the way that people engage with it. And so by doing that, it's going to go, I only want you to discuss the things that you can shout about quickly and angrily, and not have you have reasonable, intelligent, thoughtful conversations with people where you discover the things that we have more in common.
Absolutely. And I think there's a really interesting thing on Twitter, especially as well, about this kind of taking everything in bad faith, where, if there's one way that your words can be twisted to mean something that you obviously didn't mean, but which makes you look awful, somebody is bound to sort of quote tweet you and turn it into, oh, this is what you meant. And suddenly it's like thousands of people have seen it beyond that context. Which and I think it is really important to remember that that's not how normal people think. Normal people will try to give you a fair hearing, and will try to, if it's obvious that what you meant, but you were a bit clumsy about it, they'll take what you meant. And I think there is a real thing where, like, it's really easy to get in the habit of kind of talking and writing defensively if you spend too much time on Twitter, where actually that isn't at all how normal people think. But I think also where, a desire to kind of talk to your in-group can kind of lead you into quite an extreme position at the expense of the sort of relatively popular positions, which you wind up not talking about.
Yeah, it's one of the, I'm not going to go into the debate on it, but just to do out the comparison, if you are on Twitter, you will probably have seen a flame war about, especially if you're involved in politics, about trans rights. You can't have avoided it. But if you go out and talk to people on the doorsteps, it just doesn't exist. It doesn't come up. And if you were to kind of discuss it, people would just kind of go, oh, yeah, I mean, they might have an opinion on it, and it might be your opinion or it might not be. But it's likely, you would have to force that out of somebody to have a discussion on it.
I think that's a really interesting example, because the only time it's come up with any degree of frequency for me on doorsteps was when there was that row sort of in, I think it was like February or March last year, when, there was this thing of sort of asking various Labour politicians on TV to define a woman. And so it started coming up on doorsteps, but not because people felt strongly about the answer, but because they were really confused about why everyone was talking about this. So I think one of the things that is really interesting is this kind of almost revolving sort of echo chamber where, journalists are on Twitter, and therefore journalists ask politicians about the questions that are being discussed on Twitter, which, then the general public that is not terminally online is listening to this on the radio being like, what? I don't understand. Why is this an issue? And so it can be really challenging to step away from it and kind of think about how we talk to voters. in a way that sort of reflects voters' priorities rather than the sort of the bubble priorities almost. And I think you had a really interesting example as well of that, the sort of Jimmy Savile example, which is probably a good one to.
Yeah, just to kind of put across how quickly and how much emphasis gets put on individual voices from the extreme. So a couple of years ago, well, it was last year, I think, Boris Johnson, quite famously in Prime Minister's Questions, I think it was, cited or made reference to Keir Starmer not prosecuting Jimmy Savile, which is just wrong. And let's be absolutely clear about that. That story came from a man who is on social media. He lives in the next village to me. He is a sort of online campaigner, self-styled, very aggressive, very abusive, and he has just used that, came up with that and used it as a tool to beat the local Labour Party with, and in fact, kind of tar all politicians with the same brush. And it went from a man in the village next to me screaming into the void on social media to the Prime Minister saying it and trying to defend it as a reasonable point of view in Parliament. And it is, if you go through the stuff, it's nonsense. It really is.
But I think it's interesting because it turned out to be a real misstep by Boris Johnson. Obviously, morally, goes without saying, but also politically, it was a real misstep because, it led to the resignation of his close aide, Munira Mirza. And, it was one more of the many, many steps that went from the sort of Owen Paterson, trying to get Owen Paterson off the hook, and then gradually descended step by step, into his eventual resignation. And this was, one of the steps that sort of further undermined his position and his authority. And I think it is that it's a sort of, it's very common to talk about the left being sort of social media brained and kind of going down social media rabbit holes and sort of, but actually I think it's really important to remember the right does it as well. And sort of, I think actually this kind of comes back to the sort of initial conversation we had that brought us into deciding to make the podcast, is that you made the point that there's often a sort of assumption that the Overton window has sort of moved to the right, whereas actually that's almost not the case. It's just that the discourse has become Twitter brained.
Yeah, it has. And so it's, I mean, the perfect example, and I think you could ask any sort of activist Lib Dem, especially, if you're one of the people out there who's producing focuses, and if you're listening to this podcast, you probably are. Just the difference between what you put in a focus newsletter as to what you put in on Twitter, there's no comparison. I genuinely, and there is a very specific Twitter thing. Like, I'm very different on Facebook as to Twitter, and that just gives you an indication of how much it's the forum that's determining the way
Absolutely.
that you're thinking about things. Into my local kind of Facebook groups, if I dreamt of putting stuff about just even really political stuff, people aren't interested. Even if it's national politics that's really quite relevant, people aren't interested. They want to know the things that are day to day affecting them. And that difference in discourse is exactly what you've just talked about there. If you were to base any of your campaigning on just what you get from social media, you just campaign on the wrong things. And this is part of the reason, we've said before, you can't win an election on social media, partly because you'd be talking about the wrong thing.
Absolutely. And I think talking in the wrong way as well. I think there's a real thing where it's almost this like slight censoriousness to social media where you really kind of police the way that people are talking, which leads to people talking in a way that is just not how you talk in real life. And I think there's the sort of low stakes example that I would use is that sort of on social media you talk about the kind of the climate and biodiversity emergency or the climate and ecological emergency, whereas normal people will talk about the environment. And sort of we've that's been tested extensively and found that talking about the environment is much more popular and will get your impression across, your point across much better. But actually there can be a tendency to not do it because you've almost like shaped your brain and trained your brain to kind of think in a different way. So I think that kind of making sure that you consciously get out of that sort of social media brain space, when kind of engaging with voters is really important.
Yeah, I have to say, I write preemptively, defensively whenever I'm on social media. So because I know that there's people who are waiting to catch me out, and so if they push a point, I don't think, how do I respond to the point? I kind of think, well, what do you want me to say? How do I not say that? And
Absolutely.
how do I still make my point? And it's a really, your brain is getting into a really complicated way of working just to have a conversation.
Yeah.
You've had 4 steps of the conversation internally before you make a reply. And that's no way to speak to real people. Just imagine doing that on the doorstep. You're just having a chat with somebody and you're like, oh, what do they actually mean though? Do they really mean what they're saying? Do they want me to say and it's inhuman. It's changing the way that you process things as a human being. And the more that you practice that, because we are beings of habit. It takes whatever it is, 1,000 hours of practice to become a genius or an expert in a given topic. Well, by going on social media for those 1,000 hours, you've just trained yourself to be a genius.
How many thousands hours I've spent training myself on social media.
Exactly, and you've trained yourself to be an expert in not having reasonable conversations.
Hello, John from the Lib Dem Podcast here. We are delighted to say that this episode is sponsored by Pray to Reigns. Now more than ever, you need a professional-looking online presence and website. Pray to Reigns have been helping Liberal Democrat campaigns succeed for 18 years. Their Lib Dem Foci package combines a website, social media and email system to help Lib Dems win. You'll receive great support from real people, fair pricing and a huge range of features to choose from. Pray to Reigns are already the bespoke developers for Lighthouse, Lib Dem Draw Online and the LD Directory. They combine a talented system design with an unrivaled understanding of our party, our data and our systems. To find out more, check out the Pray to Reigns website at praytoreigns.co.uk/liberal-democrats.
There are plus points, and I think we're being really down on it, but there are real plus points. Like, for example, on Twitter, you get very good at writing concisely, which is a really important skill. And you also get to talk to people that have real expertise in like a whole range of policy areas. And like, if you actually try to do it, like one of the things I've really tried to do in the last kind of year or so is make sure I'm following a sort of much broader range of people. So like actively seeking out, sort of right-wing commentators and, and sort of Labour commentators, who I would often disagree with, and like finding some of the sort of more thoughtful people, from those traditions and following them, because it is that, it's that way to kind of expose yourself to different arguments, to different ways of thinking. And, I learn a huge amount from it. I gain, like, I do spend a lot of time online. I think probably partly because I've got small children, and so I can very rarely leave the house, and therefore online is how I interact with people. But I've gained a huge amount from it. So I don't think we should be too down on social media, and there are loads of positives to it. But I think there is a really interesting way in which it's kind of shaped our discourse.
It will be interesting. You mentioned Mastodon. It'll be interesting because that's been set up in a way which you can have slightly more controlled rules around sections of it. And it'll be interesting to see. We talked about the way that Twitter frames the conversation. If that helps people to have more thoughtful conversations and engage with social media in the way that you were just talking about engaging with it, which is
absolutely
a positive.
Yeah. And the one of the things that I like about Mastodon so far is that the character limit is longer. So you can sort of do much longer. Well, I mean, basically twice as long. I think it's roughly twice as long. So you can have a slightly more formed thought. I think the other thing that's quite interesting, though, is, I've really noticed an expansion in the last couple of weeks. It started to move, but then really accelerated in the last couple of weeks since the Musk buyout of people starting Substacks. And, is that going to lead to the, recreation of the blogosphere? Because the blogosphere was fantastic. But it then Google killed Google Reader, and then Twitter sort of took over, and the blog essentially has been on life support ever since. But we've then seen sort of Substack starting up again, which is a sort of really interesting form of forum for sort of longer form writing. So, you know, are we going to see that increase again?
You have to promise not to tell Richard Kemp that the blog has died, though, because he's kept the flame.
I didn't say it died. I said it was on life support, kept alive by stalwarts such as this podcast's very own Richard Kemp.
Exactly.
No, I mean, I have to say, I've never stopped reading blogs, and I still use RSS readers and things like that. But you know, this sort of, as soon as Google Reader died, you know, fewer people started doing that.
Yeah.
But you know, email newsletters starting again, you know, is that going to lead to a sort of revival of blogs and longer form writing, which, you know, I personally think would be great, because I loved blogs and I was very, very sad when Google Reader did its best to kill them.
Yes. Anyway, I think we're wandering into a niche of technology that you and I really appreciate.
Yes.
Possibly not everybody else. It would be good to just, I mean, I quite like to just go through a few. I went back to, I said at the start of the podcast, it was John Curtis and it's Victoria Ratty looking at the British Social Attitude Survey. And it's really interesting just looking at a few of the kind of issues that were brought up on that, just to give those kind of more solid examples of kind of what people think are important and what maybe aren't. And so they talked about proportion of Britons who view immigration as having a positive economic impact has increased from 20% in 2011 to a half, over 50% in 10 years. That's a massive shift. But like, if you were to go onto Twitter and try and sort of take a sample of the discourse that's on there, there's no way you would have any idea that was the case. And it is, and we talked about, it's not just an issue, but the kind of salience of that issue, how much people rate it. You know, if you look at the kind of YouGov polling of important issues, immigration stays really high. And I think I have a natural assumption to kind of go, stay high because people don't like it. But it's really interesting to take that comparison and say, oh, actually, for some people, it's really high because it's also a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really interesting framing thing with immigration as well, actually, because I've got some stats up which I saw on Twitter yesterday, I think it was over the weekend, where the how you frame it makes such a big difference. So just to kind of go through them, the sort of net view on whether immigration has enriched or undermined society, it's slightly above zero, so it's slightly positive, so very, very slightly so though. Should we have more immigration? Actually, that is quite negative. So the majority of people think we shouldn't. But actually, then if you ask, should we have more immigration in order to help our economic recovery, then it flips positive again. So I think that framing of like, why do we want more immigration? Why should we have more immigration? Really makes a difference in how many people support it. But then another sort of, interesting comparison is the difference between that sort of net immigration has enriched society figure versus has it been good for society, where significantly more people think it's quote, enriched, unquote, society than think it's been good for society. So there's presumably some people who think that it's enriched society, but that's a bad thing. So I think there's that real point about like how you frame this stuff really, really matters. And I think framing it in a way that, will resonate with normal people versus, the way that will resonate with social media. Yeah.
The sort of on the immigration issue and around Brexit, it's really so, and the polarization that you see on social media, 40% of leavers in the British Social Attitude Survey think that immigration has undermined British culture. Two-thirds of Remainers think that it's enriched Britain's cultural life. And that's that kind of really, then, once you're looking at specific groups, and then once you're into that, so for people who wouldn't necessarily, I mean, not that there was a lot of people, it was a very divisive and most people jumped to one side or the other, but that's seeing people on, are you a Brexiteer? Are you a Remainer? And then is it important to you or is it not? And like for those people in the middle, there's no discussion about that for them. And actually, that's probably because it's not necessarily very salient, and they're not good to be on Twitter shouting about it.
But also, those are the people that we need to be winning over, because the person who believes that immigration has been a disaster for this country is never going to be the person who, you know, they're very unlikely to be won over. You know, they might sort of grudgingly accept that we need, you know, would like more nurses, but, you know, they're never going to be won over. Whereas actually those people in the middle are the ones that we really need to be talking to. So kind of understanding what resonates with those people. And that's the kind of focus group evidence. It's the sort of polling evidence, and really kind of getting into sort of that mindset. I mean, and I think there's also this point around, you know, what news those people are getting and where they sort of, because I think people who are heavily involved in politics and heavy social media users will get a lot of their news from social media. Yeah. Whereas, you know, most people don't. Most people get their news from the TV, from the radio, from like headlines that they might see as they're walking past the newspaper in a shop. Or increasingly, they're getting it from social media, but from different social media sources. So if you're sort of under 25, there's a decent chance you get a lot of your news from TikTok. But like, I am not starting a TikTok account, and you know, neither are you. We're both way too old, and you know, it's not that type of forum.
I think it's interesting the way that media is then changing the way that it produces stuff in order to do that. Talk TV, I mean, I had frankly forgotten that Talk TV existed, quite mercifully for me. But they, if you listen to what their marketing strategy is, they're almost a TV channel as an adjunct to having social media. You know, they fill up the channel with whatever, but basically all they're doing is filming enough stuff to be able to put viral clips onto social media. And they're stoking, you know, they're playing to that, because they will record stuff for 24 hours, the most controversial things that will most stir opinion. And we all know this about social media, but it's, you know, really, I mean, worrying in some respects, but, you know, thought-provoking to kind of look at the way that media is changing the way it presents itself so that it can play into that on social media, so that it can have that impact. And how that is then going to be reflected in what you as a politician think seems to be important.
And meanwhile, all the sort of normal voters are being like, hey, wait, why is everyone suddenly talking about the definition of a woman? I don't understand. Exactly. So it's just that way it leaves normal voters behind.
Yeah.
So I think, to be honest, I think the main thing that we wanted to sort of cover as we come to an end was sort of suggestions for how you make sure that you know you can stay in, because I think most of us who are sort of heavy social media users and in politics enjoy social media. It's how we talk to a lot of our friends. You know, we all want to keep doing it. How do we do that while not letting it kind of seep into our campaigning, and not you know, making sure that we're staying relevant and focused on sort of normal voters and winning elections?
I mean, I think one of the most important things, and John Potter would curse us to the skies if this was not the first, is say go on the doorsteps and talk to people, because the people you need to vote for you are the people who are in the street outside your house, almost, you know, that are actually dealing with stuff on a day-to-day basis. And some of them will be on Twitter, but most of them you won't actually be engaging with in that way. And it's them who are going to tell you what's important right now. And it's them who are going to ground you when you just come out of that conversation. You know, if you just it's really easy. I do it all the time. I get buried into a kind of really argumentative thing and really kind of like tussling with somebody, which is probably pointless because they've made their own mind up anyway. But still, you know, we all enjoy banging our head against a wall sometimes. Yeah. And then, you know, going out and talking to somebody and just realizing that actually that was irrelevant to it. For them, it is not salient. They are part of that, you know, 40, 50% of people who are on a lot of things in the middle ground. And it's working out what of those middle ground things that we actually engage with really, really well already can we make a connection with? And what are the few kind of like things that they think are really important that might take a bit more work to make that connection with, but that connection really can be there. You know, and talking to people on the doorstep, even people who disagree. You know, I'm doing a survey at the moment. There's a lot of people ticking that immigration box, but on the doorstep, I can have a conversation with them about why it's important, and the questions you were saying earlier about, actually, is it important because it's enriching, or is it enriching on one hand, but there's difficulties that come with it, and having a reasonable conversation that doesn't make someone feel stupid because they disagree with you. Social media really does that thing of, like, it makes like seem like you're telling the other person that they're stupid
or evil, one or the other. Yeah. I think there's a really interesting point as well about, like, most people understand that they aren't going to agree with a politician on everything. And if you are standing up for them on the issues that they care about, they will vote for you, despite the fact they might disagree with you on a lot of issues. And even if they do actually think they're quite important. And I think there was an example, I think it was on the New Statesman podcast during the Shropshire by-election. They were sort of talking about how they'd been following Tim Farron around canvassing, and had come across a voter who was, like, extremely anti-immigration, but was voting Lib Dem because he thought that, the Lib Dems were in a better place that we'd been talking about a lot of issues that mattered, about the way that the Conservatives had been taking that area for granted, about some of the issues that we were talking about around farming. And he was thinking, well, actually, this is going to be the right choice for me and my community, even if I don't agree with them on everything. So I think there is also, like, actually, if you're talking about the issues that sort of really matter to people, they will accept you disagreeing with them on issues that might be important to you. So it's absolutely not that we should be compromising our values. It's or even that we should be trying to hide them somehow in order to kind of trick people into voting. It's absolutely not that. It's that if we're talking about the issues that matter to people, then even some of the people that don't necessarily take, I think will be then sort of more appealing to some of those, those people who, might agree with us but don't have it as a particularly high salience. But actually, we might also be able to kind of win some votes from the people who might disagree with us on those issues, but who will see the kind of core bread and butter issues as more important. And I think that's what the Conservatives did very successfully in the last election, where they were able to win the votes of a lot of people that were sort of quite liberal minded, but who really didn't want Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister and who wanted Brexit to go away.
Yeah. There's some really interesting work. There's to recommend another podcast, You Are Not So Smart, and it's a very good podcast. It did an episode on how much agreeing with a politician makes you likely to vote for them. And they did some work where they gave people a politician who agreed with them 100% of the time, and actually they were less trustworthy, viewed by people as less trustworthy than someone you disagreed with 10 to 30% of the time. And they
amazing, yeah.
So I
suppose that makes sense as well, isn't it? Because, like, if you agree with someone on everything, then it looks a little bit like, oh, do they really believe that, or are they just telling me they believe that to try and win my vote? So
so
looks a bit
sus. Window is you should be disagreeing on about a quarter of the stuff with the people who are voting for you. That's a good proportion.
Okay, right. I'm going to go out there and disagree with some voters on purpose. Don't worry, Lib Dem HQ, I am not actually going to do that. I think there's also, it's also about sort of talking to some of the, regular people in your life as well, and kind of, people who aren't in politics. We all have some friends who aren't in politics, and that's to be encouraged, and kind of thinking about how they talk and the issues that they talk about, can be quite valuable. And, drawing on that when you kind of think about how you speak. And I think also around different bits of social media as well. So I think we've talked a lot about Twitter, whereas actually, most people are on social media, but not in the same way. So, your sort of local community Facebook group where people will post once a week being like, oh no, what bin is it today? Like, that is probably the one, I found a, purple coat in the park. That's probably the group that will give you the best idea of what local people are thinking and caring about. So that's a really good one to be in and to listen to. Or, similarly at a sort of slightly wider level, there might be kind of sort of interest groups, that will, when they start talking about a political issue, that is quite, that's a bit of a flag that it's something to be interested in.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that you are going to have to go on social media some of the time as a politician. We talked about the traction in reverse, like something becomes an issue on social media and then it kind of gets traction in real life. Like, if we're trying to promote a policy, that's a good thing for us. If we can get it to have that traction and engagement, then it can transfer into the real world. Brilliant. And that's the sort of thing that, HQ and the press team are trying to do all the time. But that means that for some of that engagement, we have to put ourselves into that position, and it's not always going to be a nice place to be. Yeah. So it's having sort of techniques for yourself so that you can engage safely, and whether that's having timeouts, whether that's having, like, I have a little WhatsApp group, which is, when there's a problem on social media, anyone in the group can just kind of go, oh, there's a problem here. Can I just have a bit of help? Because just knowing that you've got a team behind you that have got your back, and just like, no, it's okay, you're right. Even if they don't manage to deal with it, just having that kind of them immediately there going, yeah, we agree with you, we've got you. That really is a supportive network for you.
And I think having a break every now and then. So like I had a nice little Twitter break during the sort of national mourning period for the Queen's funeral. Like that was great. I'll probably do it again over Christmas, just taking some time. And like I'm terrible for kind of just like picking up my phone and flicking on Twitter. So like when I take a break, what I'll usually do is I will literally get my husband to change the password for me and not give it back to me until I tell it, So, it is, take a break and really make sure you do take a break is always good advice as well.
I think that's a really good way of doing it, because like it's so easy to put yourself in the mindset of, but I have to. Like, I'm losing something might not mean I've missed something. I'm not on it. And actually, doing the thing of taking a break reminds yourself that, yeah, it is a useful tool, but it's not essential for every day. And that is such a good thing.
Cool. So, to summarise, Twitter isn't real life, and you should use it because it's great, but not all the time.
And go out and find what the real things are that really make sense to people. And that's not what you always see on Twitter.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And I guess any listeners got any further tips, write in and let us know.
Enjoy the more liberal Britain that we are in, even if you don't see it on social media.
Yeah, enjoy the secret liberalism that is Britain.